Good afternoon. I'm Husain Haqqani, Director for South and Central Asia here at the Hudson Institute. It's a pleasure to have all of you here for what I hope will be an interesting event. I'm sure that the fact that people don't like trekking out of their offices or homes on a cold November afternoon is one of the reasons why we'll probably have people who will join us a little later. But we'll start because we don't want to keep you waiting. In the year 2000, 20 million Indians had access to the internet. 17 years later, 465 million Indians were online, with 3 Indians discovering the internet every second, mostly on smartphones. 1/3 of mobile phone users in India have a smartphone today. By 2020, around 700 million will have them, and by 2025, almost 1 billion Indians will be online. Now, if you think that's all because I'm very smart that I know all this, I know it because I read Ravi Agrawal's India Connected. In most regions of the world, there was a gradual movement from landline phones to dial-up connections, to personal computers, to broadband internet, to wireless, and finally 4G, and nowadays maybe 5G. India, however, is one of the countries that leapfrogged in this area. What will be the impact of this smartphone revolution on the world's largest democracy, its economy, society, and politics? We are lucky to have with us today the managing editor of Foreign Policy magazine and the author of the recently released book, India Connected: How the Smartphone is Transforming the World's Largest Democracy. Welcome to Hudson Institute, Ravi.
Thank you so much.
And now in this book, Ravi examines how the rise of the smartphone and access to the internet has had an impact on Indian society and will be probably a big driver of changes in India's society, culture, politics, and economics. Ravi worked for CNN for more than a decade in London, New York, and New Delhi, where he served as the network's South Asia bureau chief and correspondent. He has won a Peabody Award and been nominated for 3 Emmys for his work as a TV producer. We will begin with a few comments from Ravi, so please introduce your book to us.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that very generous and kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming in the middle of your work days. So India Connected, for me, began when I moved to India with CNN in 2014. And I moved at a moment that was very important in India's history, because that was the time that India was heading to elections. And in those elections, it ended up voting in Narendra Modi, who remains the prime minister to this day. And India, of course, will have elections again next year. But so when I moved to India in 2014 of March, I remember that moment very well, because at CNN, we were setting up for the elections. We were gearing up for, what is logistically and practically the world's biggest exercise in democracy. And as often happens ahead of big moments, you tend to remember these small little moments. And one small moment that I remember very well was from my first night in India. I was staying in a hotel room, and as you often do, you switch on the TV. And for those of you who've been to India, you know that advertising in India is a very colorful sort of domain. Indian ads are great, and they sort of usually take on very colorful aspects of Indian life. So I switched on the TV, and there was an ad about, well, before I tell you what it was about, I'll tell you what I saw in the ad. So there was a politician in a village, and he was making a campaign speech with tall claims. And his claims went along the lines of, I will give you electricity, I will give you water 24 hours a day, I'll give you roads and bridges, and his promises kept getting taller and bigger. And the shot cuts to the villagers who are nodding, very sleepily, and they're accepting everything he's saying. And the shot cuts again then to these 2 young men who are sitting on a fence, and one of them pulls out a smartphone and he Googles the guy, and then he shouts out to the politician, he says, "Hey, Mr. Politician," this is all in Hindi, by the way, but I'm translating it for you. And he goes, "Mr. Politician, you know, you said all of these things 5 years ago. You made the same promises 5 years ago. Nothing's come true. Do you think we're fools? What do you think of us? Because we're villagers, we're fools?" And then the shot cuts to the rest of the villagers who start throwing things at the politician. Now, why was that ad important, and why did it sort of click something in my brain? For several reasons. India is a very divided country. It's divided along the lines of rich and poor, urban and rural, educated, not educated, the powerful, the not so powerful. All of the things that we know about India suggest that these divides are enduring, they're powerful. And there's something about that device that gave this young man the confidence, the impudence to interrupt a minister and say, "Hey, wait a minute, I fact-checked you. I know that you're wrong." And that sort of set me off on a journey to explore whether this one device, which Ambassador Haqqani has already described so well, whether it is truly transforming India, and if so, how, for good or for bad. And to quickly run through what this transformation is, I grew up in India. I left India in 2001, and when I left India, the country was already in the throes of an early cell phone revolution. And right at that time as well, there was a growing movement to get online, but it was still fairly small. It was limited to pretty much the upper classes. And the limiting factor was whether you had a PC and a telephone landline. 2% of Indians had PCs, about 3% of Indians had telephone landlines. So those people combined, another say, 1.5% to 2% of Indians could get on the internet because they were using dial-up internet. And with that, they evolved. They graduated to cable and DSL, and then routers were invented, and then they got Wi-Fi. It was a steady evolution for that particular class of rich Indians, which is very similar to the American story or the British story. But what's changed is the fact that you now have hundreds of millions of Indians who can get online because of cheap smartphones. And what is so important about this moment in India is that these cheap smartphones are also, for many Indians, their first cameras, their first Walkman and MP3 players. They are their first video devices, their first TVs, in some cases even their first alarm clocks. That's how important this device is. And in many ways, it has the ability to equalize parts of what has long been a deeply unequal society. And so the journey of the book for me began with that idea, that notion. And then I spent much of the next 2 or 3 years as I was reporting stories for CNN to look for ways and characters and stories that best exemplified this change. And we'll discuss a few of those things, but before we do, I should make clear that there are 2 things that I avoided while I was researching this book. One was English speakers. India has about 200 million English speakers, which sounds big, but it also means that 900 million Indians don't speak English. That, for me, was the more interesting market that is being transformed by the smartphone revolution. In 1999, 2000, or even 2005, if you had a Venn diagram of internet users and English speakers, there was almost complete overlap between those 2 circles. The new Indian internet is changing. The new Indian internet is for Hindi speakers, Tamil speakers, Bengali speakers, because they can access the internet, again, on smartphones that have multilingual software. Not only that, India also has about 300 million illiterate people. They can't read or write in any language at all. So for them, suddenly, the internet as well is accessible. They can speak to their phones. The first character in my book is a woman in a village in Rajasthan who excitedly shows other rural illiterate women how to use the internet. And they speak to their phones. They press a button, goes, "Okay, Google," and then they can speak to it. So they'll say something that pops into their head. "Mujhe Taj Mahal dikhao," show me the Taj Mahal. And it pops up a video in moving imagery of this great monument they've heard of but never seen. Those are the transformative things that I tried to seek out and look out for. Many of the characters in my book didn't speak English, lived in villages, because again, that's where the real change is taking place. And a lot of this is for good, as I've described in the book, in terms of access for women, in terms of education, the job market, very interesting things for and against, dating and marriage. But there's a lot more that is bad and pernicious as well, ranging from an explosion in pornography to an explosion in fake news to problems with addiction that Indians aren't really talking about, but are increasingly, a big problem that psychologists in India are talking about, mental health issues, and government overreach, all of which I guess we'll come to in a bit. But just to close, before we start discussing, like most technologies, technology of any form can be used for good or bad, and the smartphone is the same. It's not a fix-all, even though there's a lot of propaganda around the smartphone in India. But what it is an absolute tsunami of a change agent at a time when India is very ready for change. And a confluence of events has made it ready for change, ranging from the rise of its population in terms of income levels to the fact that Indian companies are now rich enough to be able to invest internally in companies like Reliance Jio, to globalization and the fact that big Chinese and Indian companies are able to flood the market with cheap smartphones and data, of course. So all of those things make this a very exciting moment for India, and the smartphone is a motif and sort of a tool that is making all of that change happen.
Well, here's my immediate reaction to your comments. This book could have been about several other countries too, because I'm sure that something similar is happening in Africa. And I know that it's happened in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, the leapfrogging effect. A lot of people all of a sudden connected, more or less the same way as you described. Other than the fact that you're from India and you discovered this phenomenon firsthand in India, why did you choose to write about India?
That's a great point, and I think Ambassador Haqqani is hinting that his next book might be Pakistan connected. But
I think Pakistan disconnected might be more likely along the lines of what I've been writing. But
perhaps,
yeah.
No, the Indian story is true of many South Asian countries, of many African countries as well. The reason why India is exceptional is the size of its English-speaking population, the history already of a very sizable, powerful internet population before smartphones came to the scene. The fact that no other country has had so many people discover the internet in such a short space of time. The fact that India is at a moment in its history where it is a rising economy with a rising middle class. No other country is as interesting to big foreign investors like Apple or Google or Facebook or Amazon or Uber, all of which are pouring money into India, thereby speeding up a revolution that was already going to happen. For all of these reasons, and the fact that no other country has so many different languages, so many different diverse cultures and cuisines, packed into one landmass. All of that makes India a unique case. And then the other big difference, of course, is with China. A lot of people often ask me whether this story is similar to the Chinese story. And the reason why it's not is that China actually began to get rich before its people got online. So the Chinese adoption of the internet is somewhere between the Western experience and the Indian experience. There's that and the fact that they are more monolithic in terms of language. And so their internet is an internet that they can really control in terms of the companies that are there, in terms of censorship, and even in terms of the internet experience. So for all of those reasons, I think India is fairly unique in its story.
How long did it take to research, and how much travel was involved? Because India is a large country, so you mentioned that you went to villages, etc. But did you by any chance make the mistake of being geographically or culturally kind of limited, or did you really capture the whole breadth of India, in your opinion?
So the book took me about 2.5 years in total, and I did a lot of this as I was reporting for CNN. So a lot of my travel was already baked in, and the good thing is that you find these amazing characters and people, and you want to tell their stories. And as a practicing journalist, you often find that a 2 or 3 minute TV piece is great, but it really doesn't scratch the surface of people's stories. And so many of the characters I found for CNN ended up becoming characters in the book, and just in a more fleshed out way. But to your point of the length and breadth in India, I tried. I mean, I don't think anyone can claim to cover the length and breadth of India. What I stuck to is places where I was very comfortable with the language. So almost all the people I spoke to in languages that they are comfortable in and they are native to. So the Hindi belt, the Bengali belt, some of the Rajasthan Marwari belt, places that were home to people whose languages I was very comfortable with. That's what I stuck to. And of course, there was a lot of travel in South India and West India. But I use translators on occasion. But I do think that, to get people to really open up to you, language really matters.
True. In your book, you assert that the smartphone is to India what the automobile was to the US. Here's a quote from your book. Cars didn't just change how Americans traveled from A to B. They transformed an entire nation. The car created the America we know. And then you say that the internet-enabled smartphone will mean the same for India. Talk to us about that.
Sure. That analogy between cars in America and smartphones in India holds true in so many different ways. And I'll give you a few examples. In the early 1900s, when the car was invented here in America, with that, so many other things began to happen. So you had the building of roads and highways and the interstate system, and then that led to the creation of tens of thousands of jobs. That led to, in turn, the building of suburbia and the picket-fenced home. And when you build all of that, you then have the commute. And with the commute to work, you then have so many other things along the way. You have the gas station and the multiplex and the diner and an entire infrastructure of things.
Even talk radio, one would argue.
Talk radio, exactly. Things that are built around the notion of people traveling these long distances to get from A to B. And then it's not just the physical infrastructure that we've seen in America, but also the cultural and imaginative infrastructure in America. I mean, you look at any movie from the 50s, 60s, 70s in America, and the car plays such a central role. If it's the bank heist, or if it is, the long weekend, or if it's the race or the chase. For many Americans, the car was their first private property. The car was their sort of way of defining their freedom. It was the way that they imagined their futures. It was mobility, literally mobility for them. And it also defined them in so many other ways. I mean, if you knew someone was driving a sedan or a hatchback or an SUV, you could place them. You knew who they were based on their car. You know how much they make. You know if they have a family. There's so many details that emerge. Take all of those things about the car and Americans, transpose it to India today. You have a young, average age 27, young population of Indians for whom the smartphone is their first private property. It is the device through which they are channeling hopes and dreams. It is a device which allows them to literally get from A to B. It allows them to look for jobs. It allows them to have a private moment, a private screen. There are all these things and connections between those two things. If you think of how today in India your status is defined by what phone you have. An iPhone means you are likely very rich. You're in the 1%. A $23 leased geophone likely means that you're not, There's so much you can tell about a person from the smartphone they now carry in India. But more than all of that, I think the smartphone for young Indians does epitomize a dream. It does epitomize this notion of progress, this notion of freedom, this notion of being able to choose, of knowing that a carpenter's son doesn't have to be a carpenter, that there's a sense of, the gig economy and its transformations, or the fact that you can use it for dating. There are all these things that make the smartphone, I think, the symbol and the motif of the new Indian dream.
You mentioned dating just now, and I have a quote from your book. Smartphones now influence arranged marriages, create an extension of one's social identity that moves beyond caste, bring within reach educational opportunities undreamed of a generation ago, bridge linguistic gaps, provide outlets and opportunities for startups, and are helping to move the entire Indian economy from cash to credit-based. You've given many examples of how smartphones have changed people's lives. Talk to us about it a little bit more.
Sure. So I think one of the big changes of all of the ones you're mentioning is, for example, the job market. There's a lot of research now that suggests that, so in the West, there are all these worries here about automation and the gig economy as, maybe destroying jobs. In India, actually, some of the research suggests that the gig economy will create jobs before it destroys jobs. And the best example I have for this is the growth of the e-commerce market. And so the current size of the Indian e-commerce market is only $25 to $30 billion a year, which is about as much as the Chinese can spend in one day on November the 11th, Singles Day, their big shopping day, or Black Friday or Cyber Monday here. So that's how small the Indian market is, which also tells you how much further it can grow. As the Indian e-commerce market grows, think about the kinds of jobs that will be created. You have packing jobs, warehousing jobs, delivery jobs, all of these things that need to be created. As you create these jobs, now think about the profile of the typical Indian worker. The typical Indian blue-collar worker is ideally matched for those kinds of jobs. So a lot of research suggests that India's great job shortage won't be addressed by this, but at least a rising gig economy will service some of those jobs that are needed for the Indian market. Uber, for example, has created 500,000 driver jobs in India. Ola, its Indian competitor, has created 1 million driver jobs in India. And that's just the start. A lot of this will expand. And of course, as India gets richer, automation and technology will destroy jobs as well. So it's a big debate, and this is just one example of how the phone will end up being central to transformation in so many different sectors. Dating and marriage, for example, is such a great topic because, most Indians don't know how to date. They don't know how to ask the opposite sex out for, a coffee. It's not normal in the same way that it is in the West. It was normal where I grew up in Calcutta because I was lucky and I went to an English school, and it was much more normal there. But for most Indians, that is not a normal thing. Most Indians have arranged marriages. And the phone allows people to dip their feet into the world of dating. It allows them to chat and text and do things that may seem very normal here, but for most Indians, again, is quite transformative in ways that we're only just beginning to understand. And one thing I always say is that tech is going to change India, but India will also change tech. One of the things that surprised me about dating in India is that I always thought that dating apps like Tinder would make Indians more westernized, which is true. But on the other hand, it will also intensify certain Indianisms. So many Indians I met who were using Tinder and an Indian app called Truly Madly, one of the first things they would do is, instead of just searching for anyone, the Punjabis were looking for Punjabi mates. The Gujaratis were looking for Gujarati mates. After they would meet, one of the first questions they would ask is, what's your star sign? Do our charts match? And so astrology was a big concern for many people I met. And so there are apps now that cater to these.
All the considerations that would occur in an arranged marriage are also kind of slipping into or are determining
Exactly.
how these more modern approaches play out.
Exactly. And so the notion that tech will necessarily drag India towards being more Western is not necessarily true. I think in some ways it may heighten or enable more traditional Indian ways of thinking. And this isn't a good or a bad thing. It is what it is.
It is what it is. Well, on the subject of it is what it is, you write about the rise of fake news and rumors, which are sent via WhatsApp or on other social media platforms, which in some cases have resulted in lynchings and killings. You have pointed out that, and I quote, smartphones have created tensions. And in a culture of hyper-nationalism, it has fomented violence and even terrorism. India's answer at some level appears to be increasing desire for government control. India is world leader in digital blackouts, ranks #1 above Iraq and Syria for enforced shutdowns. Is that the way out? What's the extent of the problem? And what would you propose as the solution?
So these are really big questions that India is beginning to grapple with. I'll take on two of them. I'll take on fake news and internet shutdowns. So fake news is a real problem, I guess, all over the world, but more so in India, I think. And the reason why is that, most of you in this room, if I had to hazard a guess, discovered the internet in the late 90s on PCs. Your first email account was likely Hotmail. You likely got chain mails in those days, and the chain mails would go along the lines of, if you don't send this message to 10 other people, you'll be unlucky in love. And I'm sure all of you then sent that message to 10 people. And then some friend,
not all of us, but carry on.
A friend like Ambassador Haqqani will write to you and say, hey, this is really stupid, don't do that, and then you'll stop doing that. So you learn from your mistakes over time. In India, what's happening is hundreds of millions of people are making this very mistake right now, all at the same time, and they're all learning together. And so the mistake they're making is mostly on WhatsApp, which is a messaging app that is linked to one's mobile number and not to email.
So forward as received.
Exactly. You get a message, you don't verify, you just forward it to tons of people on your list, and then they do the same thing, and then it sort of, in an exponential way, you make a fake piece of news viral. This has led to lynchings. It has led to Hindu-Muslim violence. It's a major problem. And WhatsApp itself is trying to deal with it by limiting the number of people you can forward messages to. But I think that's not going to be the solution. The solution ultimately is for both the private sector and the government to invest in digital literacy. And there is precedent for this. Governments all over the world have invested in campaigns to inform people not to drink and drive, in campaigns to wear seatbelts when they're driving. Governments have invested in campaigns to teach people about safe sex. So, and to come back to the car motif, the car, if one isn't educated about drinking and driving and wearing seatbelts, the car is a weapon of mass destruction. People need to see the smartphone in the same way, that if one isn't educated in terms of how to use it, if you don't have basic digital literacy, if you haven't been taught whom to trust and whom not to, and what the internet can unleash, the phone itself can be a weapon of mass destruction. And I think this is a conversation India is beginning to have in a way that's, I think, quite healthy and will hopefully lead to investment in the issue. And then very quickly to address internet shutdowns. If you don't know what internet shutdowns are, this is basically a case of where the state can switch off the internet for a particular district, a street, or an entire state. And in India, in the state of Kashmir in particular, the government has been shutting down the internet very regularly. In one case, it shut it down for 6 months. And the reason why it does this, to use another car and road analogy, if there was a small bomb attack on the street outside here, the police would cordon off the street. That's normal. The internet, and the reason for doing the same thing on the internet is that if there's a small encounter between the police and a terrorist, you'd then want to prevent the terrorists or sympathizers of the terrorists from sending out images online. So you shut off the internet. Except there's no real sense of how often do you do that? How long can you do that for? Who gets to make that decision? Can it be misused? These are all questions that are not being asked enough in India, need to be asked, especially in the state of Kashmir. And the fact that India now has more internet shutdowns than Syria and Iraq, India is #1 in the world for this practice, is quite bothering. It's troublesome. And that's an example of how amid the story of this great rising country and this transformative device, we also have the case that it can be misused in a range of ways, and the misuse is private, but it is also the state.
On this, in the realm of India Connected, one of the other downsides that you mentioned earlier was about addiction and mental health issues arising out of this. Explain that to us.
Sure.
How is that happening? What kind of addictions and what kind of mental health issues?
So there's a new disease that is called nomophobia, which stands for no mobile phone phobia, the phobia of not having your phone near you. I have a chapter that looks at this phobia, and to write it, a lot of the data I used actually came from American
Gosh,
sources.
I sometimes feel I suffer from them. From that, so
yeah, looking at your Twitter feed.
Is there a doctor you recommend for people like me? No, carry on.
There are good ones to recommend, actually. But the problem of excessive smartphone use, it's one thing for adults, it's another thing for children and teenagers. And there's a growing amount of research, especially here in America, on the impact that excessive smartphone use has on the brain. And a lot of the data suggests that glowing screens, for example, can have an effect on the brain, a dopamine effect that is similar to that of sex, for example. And you now think of 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds using the phone for a long time, and it really has an adverse effect on their brain in terms of development, but also in terms of concentration, in terms of how they're growing and developing and living normal lives, having normal childhood. There's a lot of data in America showing real links between excessive smartphone use and depression, and also suicide. These are all problems that we know are true here, and we're beginning to see signs that these are problems that are emerging in India. There isn't much data in India because it's all so new, it's all so nascent. But as with many things, when problems hit India, they tend to hit them harder than they do in the West. And so the fact that there is completely unfettered use of smartphones across the country now, and the fact that it's seen as this fix-all, it's seen as this one device, that is everything. It's your TV, your camera, your everything.
Your bank.
Your bank, your map, your calculator. And I've seen families where parents just leave a smartphone in their child's hand, and the child is 4, 5, 6 years old, and there's no real sense of teaching the child how to use this, or limiting the child's use of this device, or even looking at what the child is searching for.
And it's the only way of entertainment as well. People play games endlessly.
Yeah, it's a real problem, and I think this is going to end up becoming a major public health crisis in India, and one that I'm not even sure India is equipped to deal with, in terms of not only infrastructure, but also being able to speak openly about mental health issues in India, which is not the same as it is here, where it's not stigmatized as much. So I think this is a looming crisis for India, and it worries me immensely, and I'm not sure how India is going to deal with it.
Wow. Among the other things that you talk about, and I sensed from your book, obviously, the smartphone changes society, but society also affects the smartphone. And one of the areas where you notice it is in gender disparity.
Yeah.
You talk about the Internet Saathi program of Google and Tata Trust to get rural women online. But there is a mindset that has not changed in many parts of India. I was struck by what the owner of a tea stall told you, it's in the book, that women shouldn't have smartphones. They don't have the mental capacity. They don't have full knowledge to deal with a smartphone. If you show them the wrong things, they won't be able to deal with it, as if men can deal with it better. Yeah. Will smartphones be able to change any of this? And is there a way, again, of some conscious effort to try and change this?
So this is the chicken and egg situation. And I cover this in my first chapter, which is about women. And I made a very conscious decision to begin the book with a chapter about women. And the reason is that, when I moved to India in 2014, there were two statistics that really shocked me. Number one was that of the Indian online population, 70% of that population was male and only 30% was female. And then when you go to villages in India, it is 90% male and 10% female. That's how far behind women are. You know,
that's
one
a
is
huge,
to 9 ratio.
That's a huge disparity.
Huge disparity. And so on the one hand, it's very exciting that this device is as cheap as it is, as accessible as it is, therefore making it more likely that women will get them. It is also exciting that illiterate people can access the internet through smartphones. And the reason why this is exciting is because, again, if you look at illiteracy in India, far more women are illiterate than men, which again goes to how historically unequal India has been. So you take all of that, and it's quite positive that this device could allow women to access the internet, could give them a form of freedom, a form of hope, a form of access to the world. And then you contrast that with the fact that you meet people like the person you mentioned. He's the owner of a tea stall who, as I was going to a village near his tea stall, stopped me for a chat.
Where was this? What part of India?
This was in Gujarat.
Yeah, I thought it might be in Western India, Rajasthan, Gujarat, something like
so
that.
this was in an area called Mehsana,
Right.
which is Modi territory in Gujarat. And this tea stall owner had, a set of values and views that to me just made no sense. But he stuck with it. He said that, women are stupid. You just can't give them this device. What are they going to do with it? They're just not equipped. They can't deal. And the reason why we were talking about this is because I was headed to a village in Mehsana, and that village was in the news because it had banned the smartphone for girls under the age of 18. And I went there and I spoke to the village head, the sarpanch, who, at first just denied that this was the case. And all the people I met who were denying this were men. And I said, can I meet women? No, you can't meet women. So there was no way of really hearing the female side of the story. But then, they opened up, as Indians often do, and then everything came pouring out. It turned out that some young girls in the village had eloped. They had met someone through a phone, and they had eloped. And the way in which these village elders interpreted that story was that, if you take away the phone, they won't elope. What they didn't realize is that, they want to elope anyway. Life for them in the village is terrible. They want to study. They want to be doctors and lawyers and engineers. If they watch TV, they see videos of, empowered Bollywood stars or badminton players.
And people have been eloping long before the cell phone came
Exactly.
along.
The phone, the phone didn't invent wanting to elope. So it was a complete misanalysis, a wrong analysis of what was going on. But I learned from it that the greatest impediment to getting women online in India is men. And so on the one hand, phones, I think, will make the next generation of Indians a little bit more open. It will make them a little bit more cognizant of the rest of the world, and they will measure themselves against global peers. But at the same time, the impediment to that is men, who are the gatekeepers in India. And I imagine all of that will change at the same time, gradually. The smartphone will be a catalyst.
Political changes. What political changes does the widespread use of the smartphone bring, and what do you see in the future coming from it?
So, to go back to the story I began with, I think the voters in India will feel a little bit more empowered. They can fact check better. They can get more information. They can speak truth to power in a way that is quite remarkable to see. But there's a flip side, as there always is in India, and there's so many things to worry about. There's the worries about fake news, and while there's no evidence that it has swung an election in India yet, the way it has here, it could easily do that in elections next year. And it's so easy to geo-target things now in India by language, by community, by constituencies. So there's a real fear that the internet and smartphones can be misused in a way that is worrisome. And then the great worry as well is whether the state will overreach, whether internet shutdowns, for example, could be used as a means to swing an election or rig an election, whether data in the future could be used as a means to learn more about voters in ways that are illegal. These are all things that could easily happen. There are a lot of...
They could happen anywhere.
They could happen anywhere.
And you're afraid that they would happen in India as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I'm almost ready to open the discussion to the audience. You had mentioned, you started the discussion with how India's ads were very colorful, and I would say that the title of your book is rather colorful as well, almost as if it was made by an ad maker in India. The book is available for people to buy after this event, and I'm sure that Ravi would be patient enough to sign it for those who choose to buy it at the back. Now, questions from the audience. Yes, sir. Identify yourself and take the mic that the young lady is bringing to you. You don't have to do anything, it's ready, so just...
Thank you. My name is Ram Janakiram. I work with a non-profit organization called the Partnership for Transparency. Partnership for Transparency, whose mission is to empower civil society to reduce corruption. Now, you address this several areas and very effectively and intelligently from the consumer's point of view. It is the users of this smartphones and so on. Now, turning the table the other side, the providers of these phones, so the private sector and the government, what roles do you see the private sector should play, and what kind of a regulatory role should the government or the public sector should do?
That's a great question. I think, one of the things I would love to see happen in India is the private sector being stakeholders in digital literacy programs. And so Google, for example, has invested a lot of money in expanding the pie of internet users in India. So ensuring and making, reaching out to people in communities to make sure that more people get online. And of course, as they get online, they use Google, so this is good for Google. But as all of this is happening, I think, concerted digital literacy programs sponsored by the private sector would be very useful, because, it's one thing to just show someone how to get online. It's another thing to teach them how to be a responsible digital citizen. And it could be as easy as, either mandating a certain type of literature, multilingual, be provided with physical distribution of phones. It could be software on Android phones that, explain to you the pitfalls of fake news, that explain to you the notion of trust and whom not to trust. There are all these things, I think, that it would be fairly simple for the state to get the private sector on board to mandate all of these things. And then the other thing I worry about a little bit is competition in India. It's very important that the Indian markets stay free and fair, that newer players are allowed to come in and flourish. And I'm not suggesting that isn't happening. I think the Indian market, by and large, is a competitive market. Jio's entrance, for those of you who don't know Reliance Jio, it is a newer company that has flooded the market with very cheap phones, and for a period of about 6 months had free Wi-Fi on its free wireless internet on its service, which meant that 100 million Indians signed up in 6 months. That then led to...
Do they manufacture in India?
They do, yeah. That in turn led to one company declaring bankruptcy and a couple of other companies merging because they couldn't compete. So I worry a little bit about that space where if there's too much consolidation, then there's always the chance of companies misusing everything from prices to data. And ultimately, the great wars of the future are going to be over data. And so data protection in India needs to be enshrined in some way. And I think, the fact that India has protected constitutionally net neutrality, not constitutionally, sorry, TRI, which is a regulator in India, voted for net neutrality, unlike America here. So those are positive signs. The government itself, the Constitution, the Supreme Court had a ruling that enshrined privacy as a fundamental right. So that also
based on the Constitution.
Yeah. So that also is something that's quite heartening. But I think civil society will have to worry a lot about data protection in the future in India.
Right here in the middle.
Thank you. Bill Veal, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. Fascinating talk, and I wanted to ask you, you mentioned several times digital literacy, but it seems to me that that's the downstream side. That upstream from that is the whole issue of education in India, and the conceptual framework that people have when they get this stuff on their phone. And do you see anything going on in India to reform the education system and really bring about a more knowledgeable citizenry in the world's largest democracy? Thank you.
It's a great question. And so if my first chapter is about women, my second chapter is about education, and for good reason. There are several ways in which the smartphone is impacting education in India. I'll give you a couple of examples. So on the one hand, the phone means that you don't have to speak English anymore. You can use it and be a digital citizen in Hindi or Bengali or Marathi or all of these languages, which is great. That said, everyone wants to speak English. And so, for example, there's a great free app called Hello English, which if you speak a little bit of Hindi or can read, you speak Hindi but can read just the English alphabet, which is easy to pick up. The app then teaches you basic conversational English, basic sentences that you can learn, practice, and it has this sort of game-oriented approach to learning English. And the main character I profile in the chapter on education ranked #1 in the world on Hello English out of 11 million users. And he describes how this was very transformative for him because he would practice it, if he was stuck in a queue somewhere or in a traffic jam or, just waiting. And it became the reason for him becoming an entrepreneur and confident and, able to communicate in English in a way that really boosted his business as well. So that's just one example of how, a free software can help people in ways that wouldn't have happened otherwise because most Indians can't afford Rosetta Stone. They're not going to go to schools. So that's a helpful aspect. But in a much more broader sense, if you look at the biggest issue in Indian education, it's not higher education, it's actually primary. And so basic numeracy, basic literacy are still big problems in the Indian education sphere. And there's all this data and research that suggests that, India's managed to get kids into school, but at a certain age, around about 7, 8, 9, their learning curve just drops. And the reason is that they're not fully literate. And that's why the learning curve drops. So there are all these apps now. One of them, a very popular one called Ekstep. It's a company that was founded by Nandan Nilekani, the man who's behind not only Infosys, but India's biometric ID system, Aadhaar. And Ekstep, which is well funded by him, now is creating all these softwares for teachers to use to teach students basic numeracy and literacy. And they have ambitious targets to ensure that hundreds of millions of Indian children have a better shot at the rest of the education system by improving learning outcomes at the primary school level. So the jury's out on whether that'll work, but it's a very good base to begin with.
So an A+ for effort.
Yeah. And they're tying up with states. So
Yeah, and some states, as always, will do better than
Exactly.
some other states
Exactly.
where the culture comes in. Some
Exactly.
states are, I mean, Nandan Nilekani, whom I've met several times, is from Karnataka, and so, you know, a different attitude.
Yeah.
Whereas the more you move towards the north of India,
Exactly.
the more cultural inhibitions and race and religion and caste become issues, which they are less and less south of the Vindhyas. Any other questions on this side? Yep.
My name is Satoru Nagawa at Hudson Institute. Thank you very much. I learned a lot today. My question is related to my subject, national security. So now Chinese communication system is a national security matter in the world, especially US allies. So I want to ask the academic question. If we need to ban the Chinese phone, so what will happen is my question.
If you need to burn a Chinese phone?
If you need to,
Because most of the phones poor people can buy is Chinese phone, I expect. Is it?
That's true.
So the Chinese could use them for the security dimension of that.
Yeah, that's a big issue. So the biggest smartphone seller in India is Xiaomi. And not only that, so Xiaomi, you hear the name and you know that it's a Chinese-made phone. There are all these other phone companies in India that are very popular that you would not know from the name that they are Chinese-made phones. There's Oppo and OnePlus 6, OnePlus 5. You know, there's so many other companies.
But they're Chinese-made.
They're Chinese-made, absolutely. I mean, Lenovo is a Chinese company now. So it's a real problem. And, you know, I think India is just delaying dealing with that problem because, you know, right now these phones are so cheap and so ubiquitous. And, you know, it's not just a national security issue, which, I mean, so obviously the Indian government isn't using Chinese-made phones, but people are. And the big issue there is data. You know, I mean, whoever, if Xiaomi and therefore the Chinese state has the ability to mine personal data, private data based off of these phones, that's an immense national problem to the tune of, you know, a couple of 100 million people. The second biggest player in India is Samsung. You know, so the Indian phones only come in, there's Micromax, there's Jio, which I mentioned. They're not the number 1 and 2 players. So in that sense, India has ceded that space in the name of getting people online and in the name of, you know, the free market as well. I mean, the cheapest phone is likely going to be one of the most popular ones. I don't see that changing. I think it's a big problem.
Some other solution would have to be found to the question of data mining by the Chinese, etc. Yeah. Okay, time for a couple more questions. Yes. Deepa.
I am Deepa Olapale from George Washington University. One of the challenges that you talk about is, of course, the fake news and what has been the effect in India of the lynchings and so forth. And that raises, of course, a question about in the previous period and continuing in the print journalism, you know, in India, there are certain sort of strictures about how things are reported, like communal clashes, hate speech that could incite violence. There are certain restrictions on that. And in the print media, they don't usually say the particular religion that are involved. They'll say one community versus another, very specifically because of not wanting to do exactly what you find in this fake news and social media. But could that kind of regulations not be translated? I mean, it's the same culture, same society. It's a different mechanism. So how does one use that, what we already know, to try to, you know, mitigate its occurrences in the new social media?
It's a real challenge because on the one hand, the beauty of the internet as a space is that it's not regulated. Anyone can send anything. And on something like WhatsApp or iMessage, it's private, so you can't monitor it. It's closed. There's no oversight. There's no spying on my message to you on WhatsApp. That's not going to change. And for good reason, WhatsApp, Facebook, private companies don't want to give up that security. So if you enshrine that security, you then have the fact that people can send anything they want. I think the only way to tackle that is A, to improve the general media, to build trust in the media, so that people are at least forwarding the right kinds of sources. But linked to what I was talking about with digital literacy is the other big problem in India, but also here, frankly, which is media literacy. You know, just being able to learn the basics about how to read the news. So you read a piece, you see a piece, you know, teaching people to ask basic questions. Who wrote it? What's the dateline? Which publication was this in? Is it a publication that is privately funded? Who is the funder? You know, what is their track record? What's their history? Are they transparent? Are they declaring who their sources are, et cetera, et cetera? You know, you have to build trust. But people need to know to ask the right questions. And in a place like India, where, you know, these are questions that one isn't taught in school, I think you have to attack it again at the primary school level. And maybe this is where the private sector comes in.
Ravi, isn't part of the problem that that online and online news sources and social media are a lot less edited than the mainstream media? So all you have to do is you have, for example, in the Indian Express has an editor who can ensure that all his reporters take out the names of communities, so that if you say Hindus attacked Muslims in such and such town, then it doesn't make Muslims in other towns start attacking Hindus in reaction.
Yeah.
And so you say one community attacked another. In terms of social media and online sort of content generation, just the sheer size and number of people generating that content is too much. And that is also abused. I mean, we've heard about Russian interference and these huge content generation and social media sort of troll farms where people can sit and pretend as if they're doing it, but they're doing it as an act of cyber war.
Yep.
So it'll probably need more than just educating young people about how to figure out source. There will have to be some kind of agreement. I mean, if the world could agree on chemical weapons being too disastrous and therefore limiting them, maybe there needs to be some way of figuring out how to stop the abuse, I wouldn't say the use, but the abuse of the freedom that the right to give everybody the right to spread news, how that can actually and is being abused.
I agree with you. The only question there is, to do that, you would have to take away some freedoms. And that goes against the very nature of what the internet was, what it was designed
Fair enough.
for.
Time for one more question, so I'll let that go to you.
Hi, my name is Shruti. I am an intern here. My question was building off of the ad that you mentioned when you began your talk, about how technology can impact political awareness. And so what I wanted to say was that, considering the literacy handicaps that a large population of India still faces, the fact that a lot of people can't afford high-end phones and still use the cheap phones that cannot be used to access many sites, and the diversity of languages that exist, what kind of impact do you think technology will really have on increasing political awareness within a large part of the population of India?
Hold the answer. Remember the question. I saw two other hands go up, so let's have both those questions as well, and then you can answer all three together.
Well, this was about a sub $60 smartphone, which is in India, and it has its own app ecosystem, because only the 200 million educated Indians who have higher smartphones use the Amazons and the Twitters, and the rest of the country uses its own app ecosystem. So you mentioned some very educational apps. If there are some fun apps that you notice that they use, that would be something that'll be fun to talk about.
And here, oh gosh, you kind of, he just flew under the line. So
Hi, Yeah, my question is mostly about how you mentioned a lot of Indians are more and more comfortable accessing information and are fairly aware of social situations. But how comfortable are they giving up their information? There seems to be a deep-seated mistrust in the government and institutions, and the whole Aadhaar system. Apparently, people are saying you can't just transplant it that easily.
Now, if I don't provoke everybody else into asking another question, I'll let you have your question as well, since you did raise your hand, just as I was closing the questions. So then you can answer all of these points.
Very quickly, I guess based on what I've heard so far, and I look forward to reading more, the Indian sort of telecommunication providers should be very powerful. But we noticed in 2016, after the San Bernardino attacks here, that Apple refused to unlock phones for the federal government. By contrast, even global telecom giants are sort of really quiescent. They sort of give in to pretty much every demand of the Indian state. In fact, sometimes they offer to do what seems like the impossible. So, what sort of explains that dichotomy?
So that's a great question. I'll come back to the others. So I think I'll go in opposite order. Apple just prides itself on being very safe and secure, and I think they made the decision that it was worth it for them to preserve that reputation here in America at all costs. But I think in the great chase for new frontiers, China, India, a lot of Western companies have made concessions that are not entirely ethical in many cases. Just think of Google Maps, for example, right? I mean, Google Maps in India, because they can geotag, you can actually see parts of India that are actually in Pakistan will show up as being in India, and that's a change they can make because they can do one thing for India and another thing for Pakistan, and so these concessions are frequently made in places like India and China simply to stay there, to grow the market, to be there, to remain there, and those aren't the only ones. There are many examples of companies giving in to requests for data. Once these markets mature more, I don't know if that will remain the case. And once there are clear reputational hazards to doing so, they may not. I mean, in a sense, these new frontiers of the internet, they're kind of operating in a Wild West sort of fashion, unlike here. And so maybe that's part of the explanation behind the dichotomy. On the point of Aadhaar and trust, that's an excellent question. And I should point out that trust is sort of a motif throughout the book as well, just like the car is, because I think India is what I like to call a low trust society. And the smartphone won't necessarily fix that. But what's clear to me is that Indians are willing to invest belief in the fact that technology can help them. And the best example of that is that even though you're saying people distrust Aadhaar, 1.2 billion people have signed up. They've given the government their fingerprints and their retinal scans and their information and their details. And while there is a debate and there is valid concern over giving the government all of this data, fact remains that the people who are concerned are really in a small minority. I think by and large, thinking about privacy and data in India is a luxury. And for most Indians, they aren't really thinking about that actively, which is not to say that we shouldn't. I think we should. And I think civil society in India should really pressure the government to think more and to acknowledge the clear leakages of data that have occurred from Aadhaar and address them. And so the problem with that whole debate is that on the one hand, the government doesn't acknowledge that there have been leakages, and sometimes I think civil society can be too tough in not acknowledging that 1.2 billion people have signed up and that this is potentially a tool for immense good in India. And then to come back to the first two questions here, the way in which Indians use the internet in fun ways is very different from, I think, the way Westerners do. The most popular example is on WhatsApp, which is more of an Indian app than a Western app now. because the biggest audience for WhatsApp is in India. But every morning, many Indians will send each other these good morning messages, which is usually a JPEG of a rose or a lotus or a religious figure with the words good morning or hello or whatever the case may be. And WhatsApp realized that they were having these bandwidth issues every morning around about 7 a.m. And it was really just millions of Indians saying good morning to each other. So there are all kinds of funny and unique ways.
To each other and to friends abroad.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get them too.
Absolutely.
And there's an Indian version of WhatsApp now. It's called Share Chat, where you can use Indian languages. And, this is a space that is rapidly going to expand and become more Indian and more indigenous and use more Indian language. And then lastly, just to end...
Shruti's very important question about political awareness.
Yeah. I don't know if this is going to directly answer your question, but I see the smartphone mostly as a catalyst. I think India's in a moment where there's so many changes that are already underway. The rise of the middle class, greater equality between the sexes, rapid urbanization, a younger generation of Indians who are becoming, more idealistic, more nationalistic, but at the same time also more westernized in certain ways. All of these things are happening anyway. Along comes this device that, is built into it is so much hope and so much propaganda as well. And I don't think it's going to be a fix-all. I don't think we should see it as a fix-all, but it is certainly going to speed up a lot of the churn and change that is already underway. And that's why I think it is the most transformative force in India, more than electricity, more than the car. This is the thing that defines modern India.
Well, thank you very much, Ravi Agrawal, everybody. And
thank you.
Please remember to pick up a copy of the book, which Ravi will sign for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming.